I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
Chapter 1. The silent witness in the Brownstone. The doorbell at the Brownstone is a sound that generally promises either a check for my boss or a headache for me. On a Tuesday morning in October, it delivered the latter in the form of a woman who looked as though she had been carved out of cold marble and polished until she shone. I let her into the office, noting the way she skirted the rug with the caution of a woman afraid of catching a common cold from the furniture. Nero Wolfe was behind his desk, looking like a mountain that had decided to take up permanent residence in a yellow chair. His eyes half closed as he contemplated the recent arrival of a shipment of Vanda orchids. He didn't even look up as I crossed to my desk and settled in. The woman was named Mrs. Elena Vance, no relation to anyone I cared about, and she stood there clutching a handbag that cost more than my first car, waiting for the mountain to acknowledge her existence. Wolfe eventually sighed, a sound that started somewhere deep in his diaphragm and ended with a slight twitch of his lips, indicating he had been disturbed from a particularly interesting thought regarding a new potting soil mixture. He asked her, with a politeness that was entirely theatrical, if she had come to discuss the current state of the weather, or if she had a more tangible reason for trespassing on his time. Mrs. Vance sat down without being asked, which was mistake number one, and proceeded to tell us that someone had been systematically dismantling her reputation, not by slander, but by the physical removal of specific, seemingly worthless items from her private study. She was wealthy, she was anxious, and she was clearly hiding something that had nothing to do with her trinkets. Wolfe remained motionless, his fingers laced over his stomach, listening to the tale of a missing fountain pen, an antique letter opener, and a single page from a diary that had been torn out with surgical precision. It was the sort of petty annoyance that Wolfe usually dismissed with a flick of his wrist. But when she mentioned that the items were replaced by carefully curated photographs of his own office, taken from angles that suggested a familiarity with his routine that bordered on the obsessive, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Wolfe opened his eyes fully, the lethargy vanishing as if it had never been there. He didn't ask about the money, which she had already offered with a gesture toward her purse, but instead asked her to describe the exact position of the fountain pen on her desk before it vanished. As she spoke, I took notes, watching the way she tapped her foot and the way she avoided looking at the portrait of Wolfe's father on the wall. I didn't like her, but I liked the idea of someone playing games with Wolfe's privacy, even less. When she finally finished, Wolfe sat in silence for a full minute, the only sound in the room the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. He told her she could go, that I would be in touch, and that if she dared to lie to me during the course of my investigation, he would not only drop her case, but would ensure her reputation suffered more damage than any petty thief could inflict. She left, leaving behind the faint, sharp scent of lavender and the undeniable feeling that the Brownstone was no longer quite as private as it had been 20 minutes ago. Wolfe reached for a book of poetry, his expression unreadable, and told me to get Fritz to bring up some beer, as it was going to be a long and tedious afternoon. I didn't argue. I had a feeling the real trouble hadn't even knocked on the door yet. Chapter 2. An intrusion of elegance. I spent the rest of Tuesday morning making phone calls, though not the kind that require a badge or a warrant. By 2 inches the afternoon, I had confirmed that Mrs. Elena Vance was exactly who she claimed to be, a socialite with enough money to buy a small country and enough enemies to fill a medium-sized prison. Her husband was a venture capitalist who spent most of his time in Zurich, and her private study was indeed a fortress of security, which made the selective disappearance of her trinkets all the more puzzling. I told Wolfe as much while he was busy cataloguing a new batch of paths, his attention divided between the health of the root systems and the details I was feeding him. He did not seem particularly interested in the socialite herself, but his office photographs were another matter. He had them laid out on his desk, staring at them with a mixture of annoyance and genuine intrigue that usually preceded a very unpleasant time for whoever was on the other end of his ire. I could tell he was piecing together a pattern, though he was not about to share it with me until he had finished his lunch. That lunch, consisting of a delicate trout almondine and a side of chilled asparagus, was interrupted by the doorbell, an intrusion that signaled the end of my quiet afternoon of record-keeping. I made my way to the foyer, expecting perhaps a courier or maybe a delivery of more plants, but found a man standing on the stoop who looked like he had been poured into his suit. He was young, sharp, featured, and carried himself with the kind of restless energy that usually suggests a man who is looking for something he has no business finding. He identified himself as Arthur Pendergast, a private secretary to one of Mrs. Vance's business associates, and he insisted on seeing Wolfe immediately, claiming that his employer had information regarding the items that had gone missing from the study. I did not like his face, and I liked the way his eyes scanned our hallway even less, noting the heavy locks and the security measures that had kept the Brownstone safe for decades. I told him Wolfe was unavailable, but he pushed past me with a confidence that would have been charming if it hadn't been so remarkably rude. By the time I caught up to him, he was already standing in the threshold of the office, looking at Wolfe with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Wolfe did not look up from his trout, his fork poised halfway to his mouth. He simply waited, his silence acting like a physical barrier in the room, until the man felt the weight of it and stopped pacing. Wolfe asked him if he had been taught that doors were meant to be used for entry only after an invitation, his voice a smooth, low rumble that carried a hidden edge. The man laughed, a brittle sound that did not reach his eyes, and started to speak about the importance of the situation. But Wolfe cut him off. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He merely pointed a finger toward the hallway, and told him that if he did not vacate the premises in the next 10 seconds, he would be physically removed by me, and that he would find that the process was far less delicate than he anticipated. Pendergast paled, realized he was not going to get the reaction he wanted, and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He left, but not before dropping a small, heavy envelope on the floor, an action that seemed to cost him a great deal of effort. Once he was gone, and the door was bolted, I picked up the envelope and brought it to the desk. It contained nothing but a single blank sheet of paper and a small silver key, an object that looked like it belonged to a bank deposit box, or perhaps something even more restrictive. Wolfe took the key with a pair of tweezers, holding it up to the light, as if he were inspecting a rare orchid for signs of disease. He asked me to check the lock on the front door twice, then told me to call Sol Panzer. He didn't say why, and he didn't have to. I knew that when Wolfe started ordering extra surveillance on his own front door, the situation had shifted from a petty theft to something much more dangerous. I went to the phone, wondering how a woman with too much money and a secretary with too much arrogance had managed to drag us into this particular mess. I had a bad feeling that before the week was out, I would be spending a lot of time on the streets, and that the Brownstone would not be the quiet sanctuary it had been until now. As I dialed Sol's number, I looked over at Wolfe, who was once again focused on his ledger, but his posture was different, his hand tense, his mind clearly working at a pace that left the rest of the world behind. I finished the call, confirmed that Sol would be over by evening, and sat back, watching the shadows lengthen across the office floor. The silence in the house had become heavy, pregnant with the kind of secrets that usually ended in a reckoning. Wolfe finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion, and told me that the game had begun in earnest, and that we were already playing from behind. I didn't ask him how he knew, because I knew he was right, and I didn't need to ask who the opponent was because, in this business, the identity of the enemy was always the last piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Chapter 3. The roster of discontent Sol Panzer arrived just as the sun began to dip behind the neighboring buildings, bringing with him the usual air of quiet competence that made him the only man I ever fully trusted with a tail. He sat in the chair that Arthur Pendergast had so recently occupied, his face a neutral mask that gave away nothing of the day's work. Wolfe, having finally finished his day's study of his orchids and retreated into the sanctuary of his desk, looked at Sol with a nod of approval. I took my place at my desk, my notebook open, ready to record whatever news Sol had brought from the city. As it turned out, the news was less about the missing items and more about the connections between the people orbiting Mrs. Elena Vance. Sol had spent the afternoon shadowing 3 individuals who occupied the inner circle of the Vance household: a disgruntled archivist who had recently been fired, a former business partner who had been on the losing end of a merger, and a personal lawyer who seemed to have more assets than his salary could possibly account for. The picture Sol painted was not one of simple theft, but of a tightly wound spring of resentment and ambition. Each of these people had a reason to want Mrs. Vance to feel exposed, to feel the walls of her own home closing in on her, and each had been seen in proximity to one another at a private club that catered to the city's upper-crust malcontents. Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and rhythmic. He didn't ask for details until Sol finished, and when he did, his questions were precise, targeting the financial dependencies of the suspects rather than their emotional states. It was clear that Wolfe was looking for a leverage point, a crack in the foundation that he could exploit to bring the whole structure down. He asked Sol to prioritize the lawyer, a man named Henderson, whose recent acquisitions of offshore property suggested that he was liquidating his client's assets long before he had any legal right to do so. I watched them, the 3 of us forming a quiet axis of inquiry in the center of the Brownstone, while outside, the city continued its relentless, indifferent churn. It was the kind of setup I liked, where the variables were limited and the motives were rooted in the oldest, most reliable human failures: greed and the need for control. Wolfe eventually dismissed Sol, giving him instructions to keep a watch on the lawyer's office through the night, and to report any movement that seemed even remotely out of place. Once the door clicked shut behind him, Wolfe turned his attention to me, his gaze sharp and expectant. He asked for my own observations of Mrs. Vance during her visit, specifically regarding her reaction to the office photographs. I told him what I had felt, the way she had seemed less afraid of the thief than she was of what the thief might actually know about her. It was a subtle distinction, but one that clearly mattered to Wolfe. He nodded, satisfied, and stood up, a rare occurrence that usually signaled he was heading to the kitchen to consult with Fritz on the menu for dinner. Before he left the room, however, he paused, his back to me, and spoke about the nature of a home. He remarked that a house is more than just a place to store one's possessions. It is a repository of one's history, and to have that history systematically dismantled and replaced with evidence of intrusion is a violation that goes far beyond the loss of property. He didn't name the thief, but he alluded to a mind that was not just looking to steal, but looking to curate a narrative of vulnerability, a psychological siege that would eventually force the occupant to make a mistake. I remained at my desk for a while after he departed, listening to the muffled sounds of the kitchen, the clatter of plates, the hum of the refrigerator, the low, melodic voice of Fritz as they discussed the evening seasoning. The Brownstone felt different tonight, less like a fortress, and more like a stage where a play was already in progress. The actors moving in the dark, waiting for their cues. I looked down at the photograph that Pendergast had left behind, the one depicting the office from the perspective of the doorway, and realized that I had been wrong about the thief's motive. It wasn't just about the items, it was about the space itself, and the fact that we were currently occupying that space, unaware of how closely we were being watched from the outside. I pulled my coat on, deciding that a walk around the block wouldn't hurt, and that a little fresh air might clear the feeling that someone was standing right behind me, even when I knew the room was empty. As I stepped out into the cool, crisp night, the city seemed to mock my unease, its lights blinding and its noise deafening, a stark contrast to the calculated intellectual quiet of the room I had just left. I knew then that the roster of discontent was longer than we had anticipated, and that the silence in the Brownstone was about to be broken in ways that none of us could fully predict. I had a job to do, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure if the truth was something we really wanted to uncover, or if it was something that would consume us all before the final act. Chapter 4. Archie's rounds in the city the following morning. The Brownstone was quiet enough to hear the dust mote settling, which is a state of affairs that usually irritates Wolfe to no end. He was occupied with a new monograph on the influence of atmospheric pressure on orchid hydration, leaving me to my own devices. I had a list of names provided by Saul the night before, and the city was waiting to be canvassed. I started with the Henderson law offices, located in a building that had far too much glass and not nearly enough soul for my taste. I didn't plan on walking in through the front door and announcing my business. That was a quick way to get escorted out by a security guard who probably took his job entirely too seriously. Instead, I hovered in the lobby, posing as a frustrated delivery man, watching the comings and goings of the staff. Henderson himself emerged around 10, looking exactly as Saul had described, polished, expensive, and vibrating with the kind of nervous energy that comes from holding onto a secret that is actively burning a hole in your pocket. I followed him, keeping a respectful distance through the crowded streets of Midtown. It was a game of cat and mouse, only I was the cat, and the mouse had a penchant for expensive tailors and jittery glares over his shoulder. He led me on a tour of the city's more pretentious coffee houses and back-alley financial offices, finally stopping at a small, unassuming brownstone on the Upper East Side that looked suspiciously like a miniature version of Wolfe's own home. I hung back, watching him converse with a man who had the build of a retired heavyweight and the eyes of a ferret. They stood on the steps, the wind catching their conversation and carrying away everything but the tension that bound them together. I caught enough fragments of their dialogue to know that the items taken from Mrs. Vance were not the end goal, but rather the currency for a much larger blackmail operation. Henderson wasn't just managing her money, he was orchestrating a controlled demolition of her public life. I ducked into an alleyway, pulling out my notebook to jot down the physical description of the second man, who I was willing to bet was the muscle behind the operation. It was clear that the theft was intended to draw someone like Wolfe into the fray, perhaps to serve as a distraction, or, worse, as a target. The realization made the back of my neck prickle. If they wanted Wolfe's attention, they had succeeded, but they had severely underestimated his capacity for turning a trap into a hunting ground. After they parted ways, I trailed the muscle, a man I would eventually identify as a low-level enforcer named Miller, to a warehouse district that smelled of saltwater and stagnant history. It was the kind of place where things go to disappear, and as I watched him enter a side door, I decided I had seen enough for one afternoon. I slipped back into the flow of pedestrian traffic, feeling the weight of the city pressing in from all sides. I needed to get back to the office to relay what I had seen to Wolfe before he made a decision based on incomplete information. The ride back to the Brownstone was a blur of taxi horns and angry commuters, all of whom seemed to be in a hurry to reach a destination that didn't matter. When I finally stepped back into the office, the contrast was immediate and jarring. Wolfe was sitting in his chair, the same way I had left him, as if the hours had not passed at all. He didn't look up from his book until I had finished detailing the meeting between the lawyer and the enforcer. When I reached the part about the house on the Upper East Side, he finally closed the book, his fingers tracing the gold leaf, lettering on the spine. He didn't ask for my opinion, which I took as a sign that he had already formed his own. He simply instructed me to call Saul again and tell him to shift his focus to the property records of that specific brownstone. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the empty space in front of him, his expression one of cold, calculating clarity. I realized then that the case had evolved into something much more personal than a mere theft. The disruption of the brownstone, the photographs, the deliberate baiting, it was an invitation to a duel, and Wolfe, despite his sedentary nature, was a man who never declined a challenge of intellect. I went to the phone, the familiar weight of the receiver in my hand, providing a small sense of grounding in a day that had felt increasingly untethered. As I dialed, I looked over at the desk and saw that Wolfe had already begun to draft a letter, his handwriting fluid and precise. I didn't need to read it to know that someone was about to receive a very unpleasant surprise. The game was no longer being played on their terms, and the silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the silence of contemplation, but the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. I finished my call, feeling the adrenaline finally start to subside, replaced by a grim satisfaction that we were finally moving toward the endgame, regardless of the cost. Chapter 5, The Displaced Collection. The next morning brought a chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat, and everything to do with the package waiting on the vestibule floor. When I brought it into the office, Wolfe didn't even glance at it, though his nostrils flared in a way that signaled his irritation. It was a wooden box, small and heavy, and when I pried the lid open, the contents made me wish I had stayed in bed. Inside were 3 items: a silk scarf belonging to Mrs. Vance, a set of keys to the Brownstone's own side entrance, and a photograph of Wolfe, taken from inside the office, dated yesterday. The implications were as clear as they were. Someone had not only been in our house, but had been standing close enough to photograph the back of Wolfe's head while he was buried in his correspondence. I left the box on his desk, keeping my distance as if it were a live grenade. Wolfe sat in absolute silence for 10 minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and measured, which was his way of calibrating his rage before it could spill over into something unproductive. He didn't ask me to analyze the key or the scarf. He already knew their significance. They were a challenge, a declaration of intent to prove that no sanctuary, not even his, was impervious to their reach. He finally spoke, his voice unusually thin and precise, instructing me to contact every locksmith we knew to check the security of our perimeter. He wanted the side entrance reinforced with a secondary bolt that only he and I could operate, and he wanted it done within the hour. While I was on the phone, he turned his attention to the photograph, studying it with a clinical detachment that would have unnerved a lesser man. I could see his mind working, the gears turning with a mathematical certainty that was both impressive and a little terrifying. He wasn't just looking for a thief, he was looking for a ghost, someone who understood the architecture of the house and the rhythm of our daily lives well enough to walk through them unseen. I finished my calls, feeling the urgency of the moment, and set about securing the house as if we were preparing for a siege. It felt absurd, reinforcing the doors of a house that had stood for years as a symbol of domestic tranquility. But the evidence in the box was undeniable. The intruder had been here, and they had taken exactly what they wanted to ensure. We knew they were capable of more. As I worked, I couldn't help but think of the suspects Saul had been tracking. Henderson the lawyer, the archivist, the muscle, they were all pieces of a puzzle that were being moved by a hand I couldn't see. Wolfe, for his part, had retreated into his thoughts, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if the solution were written there in the shadows. He didn't offer any commentary, didn't complain about the noise of the installation, and didn't even ask for a beer. He was in the zone, the dark intellectual place where he dismantled his enemies piece by piece before ever laying a hand on them. I knew better than to interrupt him. I finished the work, checked the locks twice, and sat at my desk, listening to the silence of the room. It was a different kind of silence now, brittle and expectant. I felt like a sentry on a battlefield, guarding a post that had already been compromised. I watched Wolfe, a mountain of a man who held the secrets of half the city in his head, and wondered how he was going to turn this invasion into a victory. He seemed to sense my gaze, turning his head slightly, and for the first time in my memory, he looked trolled, not by fear, but by the sheer audacity of the game being played against him. He beckoned me over, gesturing toward the desk. He had rearranged the items from the box, laying them out in a specific sequence that mirrored the layout of the office. He pointed to the photograph, then to the key, his finger tapping the wood with a rhythmic insistence. He explained that the thief was not just after the items, they were building a narrative of power, a way to show that they could reach into the center of our lives and take whatever they pleased. He wasn't bothered by the theft, but he was insulted by the intrusion. He told me that this was the final piece of the bait, the act that would force the perpetrator to commit a fatal error in their arrogance. He instructed me to set up a meeting with Mrs. Vance, not at the house, but at a location of his choosing, a public, neutral ground where he could force the issue. He didn't elaborate, but the tone of his voice was enough. He had a plan, and it was going to be elegant, devastating, and entirely unexpected. I left the room, the weight of the key in my pocket, feeling heavier than it had before, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The house was secure, but the real threat wasn't outside the door anymore. It was already in our heads, and it was only a matter of time before it demanded to be heard. Chapter 6, Shadowed Correspondence. The arrangement for the meeting was a masterpiece of indirection, the sort of maneuver Wolfe loved to execute when he wanted to pull the rug from beneath a suspect without them realizing they were falling until they hit the floor. He had sent me to meet Mrs. Vance at a secluded, high-end botanical garden on the outskirts of the city, a place he knew would offer the illusion of privacy, while actually being under the watchful eyes of Saul Panzer. I spent the morning playing the part of the dutiful assistant, escorting the woman through the greenhouses, all while my skin crawled with the knowledge that the same people who had pilfered our brownstone were likely following us. Mrs. Vance was a nervous wreck, her composure cracking under the weight of the missing items and the implicit threats that had been sent to her home. She clutched a lace handkerchief, her eyes darting toward every shadow, and I had to work hard to keep her focused on the questions I was posing. I needed to know what the thief really wanted, and I needed to know if she was holding back any information about the specific nature of those items. As we walked, I noticed the same heavy-set man I had seen on the Upper East Side, loitering near a display of tropical ferns. He was doing a terrible job of acting like a casual observer, his gaze never once straying from our position. I didn't let on that I had seen him. Instead, I steered Mrs. Vance toward a bench in a more open area where I could keep an eye on him while ostensibly continuing our conversation. I leaned in and told her, in a voice meant only for her, that Wolfe had a lead on the items and that he believed the thief was someone she knew intimately. The reaction was immediate. Her face drained of color and her hands began to tremble. She didn't deny it, which told me everything I needed to know. The theft wasn't about extortion in the traditional sense. It was about humiliation, a way to punish her for a transgression that remained hidden in her past. I pressed her for details, not with threats, but with the quiet assurance that Wolfe was the only person who could stop the dismantling of her reputation. She finally relented, whispering about a series of letters she had written years ago, letters that were never meant to be read by anyone other than their intended recipient, a man who had since passed away, or so she had believed. The thief was holding those letters, using them to force her into a corner, and they were using the stolen trinkets from her study as tokens of their progress. It was a classic blackmail scenario, elevated to a level of psychological warfare that was as cruel as it was effective. As she spoke, the reality of the situation solidified. The photographs of the Brownstone, the keys, the stolen objects, they weren't just about us, they were part of a larger plan to force her to settle a debt that she thought was long since paid. I made a mental note of everything she said, ensuring that I didn't miss a single inflection or hesitation. When she was finished, I signaled Saul, who was lurking behind a nearby palm, that the bait had been taken. He vanished into the greenery, and I escorted a much more composed, albeit terrified, Mrs. Vance to her car. The ride back to the office was silent. My mind was racing with the implications of her story. If the thief was targeting her reputation using those letters, why involve us? Why break into the Brownstone and take photographs? The answer, I realized, was that they were creating a trail, a series of breadcrumbs designed to lead us into a conflict that would eventually force them out of the shadows. They wanted Wolfe to intervene, perhaps believing that by involving him, they could legitimize their own agenda, or, more likely, use his reputation for justice as a shroud for their own malice. When I finally entered the office, the atmosphere was oppressive. Wolfe was sitting in his chair, his eyes fixed on the door, and he seemed to know exactly what I had discovered before I even spoke. I sat down and recited everything she had told me, watching the way he absorbed the information, his face an immovable mask of concentration. He didn't offer a single word of surprise or judgment. Instead, he reached for a pen, his movements deliberate, and began to map out the connections on a notepad. He told me that we had enough now to force the hand of our visitor, and that the next phase of his plan would involve a direct, unavoidable confrontation. He asked me to ensure the house was secure, then told me to order a large pot of coffee, as we had a long night ahead of us. As I moved toward the kitchen, I knew that the silence of the Brownstone was about to end, and that the storm we had been waiting for was finally on our doorstep. The game of shadows was over, and the time for a reckoning had arrived, regardless of what that might cost us in the end. Chapter 7. The architect of chaos Wolfe sat in his chair like a judge, presiding over a court that existed only in his mind. The coffee pot had been emptied and replenished twice, and the air in the office was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the silent intensity of his concentration. He had spent the last 3 hours sketching out the logic of the extortion, tracing the thread of the letters from the hands of the dead to the hands of the living. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with the kind of clarity that usually meant someone was about to lose their freedom or their reputation, or perhaps both. He told me that the mastermind behind the scheme was not Henderson, the lawyer, but rather the archivist's soul had been watching, a man named Julian, who possessed the one thing every blackmailer craves, the ability to find what is lost and weaponize it. Julian had been the one to organize the records, the one who understood the geography of Mrs. Vance's past better than she did herself, and he was the one who had choreographed the intrusion into our home to validate his own importance in the eyes of his associates. It was a power play, plain and simple. Julian wanted to demonstrate that he could touch the untouchable, that he could make a man like Nero Wolfe dance to his tune, and that he could orchestrate a grand performance where every piece of evidence was meticulously placed to lead us in the wrong direction. Wolfe didn't look angry. He looked amused, the kind of amusement that is far more dangerous than rage. He explained that we would not be chasing after this man, but rather inviting him to the stage he so desperately wanted to occupy. He told me to reach out to the contacts we had in the dad's office, specifically the ones who were tired of being made to look foolish by clever criminals. He wanted a net thrown, but he wanted it to be invisible until the very moment it closed. I spent the next hour on the phone, navigating the bureaucracy of the city's legal system, making promises and dropping hints that were heavy with the weight of Wolfe's involvement. It was a delicate dance of favors and threats, but by the time I hung up the final receiver, the pieces were in place. I went back to the office to report my success, and I found Wolfe drafting an invitation, a formal, impeccably worded note to Henderson, to Julian, and to the muscle, Miller. It was an invitation to the Brownstone framed as a discussion regarding the settlement of the Vance matter, and it was written in a tone that suggested Wolfe was prepared to concede. It was the perfect lure. Julian would assume that Wolfe had finally reached his limit and was looking for a way out, and his ego would force him to attend the meeting to witness the capitulation. I read the draft and almost laughed. It was a masterpiece of deceit. Wolfe looked at me, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair, and asked if I believed the fish would bite. I told him that for a man as arrogant as the archivist, the opportunity to watch Wolfe surrender would be impossible to resist. He nodded, satisfied, and told me to get some rest, as the following day would be the most demanding of the entire affair. I went to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept returning to the photograph of the office, the realization that we had been watched, and the knowledge that tomorrow we would have these people in the same room where they had practiced their petty, invasive theater. I thought about the letters, the stolen trinkets, and the way the entire scheme had revolved around the idea of breaking down the walls of our lives. But Wolfe had simply adjusted the architecture, turning his own home into a trap that none of them would see until it was too late. I listened to the house, the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the floorboards, and wondered if the intruders had felt the same sense of history and permanence that I did. They were amateurs of the worst kind, believing that intelligence could be mimicked by malice, and they were about to learn that in the Brownstone, the only law that mattered was the one that Wolfe held in his head. I finally drifted off. The image of the office as a stage burned into my brain, knowing that when I woke, the final act would be waiting to unfold. The silence was still there, but it felt different now. It was the quiet of a coiled spring, ready to snap at the first touch of an intruder who thought he was the guest of honor. Chapter 8. The Gathering of Shadows. The following evening, the Brownstone possessed an atmosphere I hadn't felt since the Miller case went south, a heavy expectant stillness that seemed to draw the very oxygen from the rooms. Fritz had been instructed to prepare the office with a precision that bordered on the fanatical, clearing away the clutter of the day and ensuring that the 3 chairs positioned opposite Wolfe's desk were arranged at exact, uncomfortable intervals. Wolfe sat in his throne, his yellow shirt pressed to a crisp, pristine finish, his hands folded across his middle in that familiar deceptive posture of absolute calm. He had not moved for an hour, his eyes fixed on the door as if he were waiting for the arrival of ghosts. I took my position at my desk, my notebook ready, though I doubted I would need it for anything other than the final confirmation of their hubris. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. A sharp, insistent sound that pierced the quiet of the house like a gunshot. I crossed the foyer, the hardwood floor echoing under my feet, and opened the door to find our 3 guests waiting on the stoop. Henderson stood in the center, his posture rigid, with a forced professional confidence. Julian, the archivist, flanked him with a thin, sharp-featured smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miller, the muscle, hung back in the shadows, his presence a dark, looming reminder of the physical threat that had been hovering over us for the past week. I ushered them into the office without a word, watching the way they scanned the room, looking for signs of the surrender they expected, but finding only the cold, impenetrable silence of the Brownstone. They took their seats, chairs creaked under their weight, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. Wolfe remained motionless, his eyes closed, his presence filling the room in a way that made the space feel suddenly cramped and claustrophobic. It was Henderson who broke the silence, his voice a little too loud, a little too strained, as he began to outline the terms of the settlement. He spoke of mutual interests, of the necessity of discretion, and of the desire to put the entire matter of the Vance affair behind us. He was a good talker, the kind of man who could sell you your own front door, but as he spoke, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, and the way Julian's fingers were drumming a restless, anxious rhythm against his knees. They were playing a part, performing the script they had written in their own heads, but they were doing it on Wolfe's stage, and the rules of the play had changed without their knowledge. Wolfe didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the wall behind their heads, his breathing slow and measured, a physical manifestation of the control he held over every second of the encounter. When Henderson finally finished, the silence that followed was even heavier than before. Wolfe waited, letting the tension stretch until it was almost palpable, until the men in the chairs began to shift, their eyes darting toward one another in growing unease. He then spoke, his voice low and rich, a velvet-covered brick that hit the room with the force of an indictment. He didn't address the settlement. He didn't even acknowledge the presence of the letters. Instead, he began to describe the history of the house, the sanctity of the Brownstone, and the nature of the intrusion that had taken place. He spoke with a precision that was terrifying, listing the dates, the times, and the specific items that had been taken, all with an accuracy that suggested he had been watching the thieves every step of the way. He didn't mention the photographs, but when he turned his gaze toward Julian, the archivist flinched as if he had been struck. Wolfe's voice grew colder, more detached, as he transitioned into an analysis of their motives, stripping away their justifications of greed and ambition, until all that remained was the pathetic, ugly reality of their malice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was dismantling them not with accusations, but with the weight of the truth. He laid out the sequence of their actions, the theft of the trinkets, the staging of the intrusion, the attempted blackmail of Mrs. Vance, and as he spoke, I could see the confidence draining from their faces. Miller looked toward the door, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning realization that they were not here to negotiate a deal, but to be judged. Julian tried to interrupt, to inject some level of defiance back into the conversation, but Wolfe silenced him with a single sharp gesture of his hand. It wasn't just a physical move, it was a command that carried the weight of absolute authority. The room was no longer theirs. The narrative had shifted, and they were no longer the authors of their own fate. They were trapped in the logic of a man who saw everything, and who was now holding them exactly where he wanted them, in the silence of his office, waiting for the final word that would seal their undoing. 9. The anatomy of a deception. The tension in the office had reached a point where the air felt electrified, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Wolfe remained seated, his mass behind the desk providing a gravitational pull that kept the three men anchored to their chairs. Henderson's veneer of professional Polish had completely disintegrated. He was now just a man in a rumpled suit, his eyes flicking toward the door with an intensity that bordered on panic. Julian, however, was a different study entirely. His face had gone pale, a stark, bloodless mask, but his jaw was set with a desperate kind of defiance. He was the one who had choreographed the intrusion, the one who had fancied himself the architect of this little drama, and he was clearly struggling to reconcile the reality of his failure with the arrogance that had brought him to this point. Miller, the enforcer, had retreated into a sullen, heavy silence, his hands resting on his knees, his muscles coiled like a spring that had lost its tension. Wolfe let the silence linger, a deliberate tool he used to ensure the weight of his previous revelations settled firmly into their minds. When he finally broke it, his voice was not loud, but it possessed a clarity that sliced through the room like a razor. He began to dissect the logistics of their operation, not as a theory, but as a forensic audit. He detailed the exact movements of Miller during the break-in, citing times and locations that confirmed we had been tracking his movements for days. He spoke of the specific items that had been stolen, the fountain pen, the letter opener, the single page from the diary, and explained their significance not as objects of value, but as psychological markers designed to heighten Mrs. Vance's terror. He spoke of the photographs, which he had pulled from his desk drawer and laid out in front of Julian, like a hand of cards in a losing game of poker. The pictures showed not just our office, but the clandestine meetings they had held in the city, the illicit exchanges, and the moments where they believed themselves to be completely shielded by the anonymity of the crowd. Julian gasped, a soft, involuntary sound, as he saw the proof of his own visibility. Wolfe wasn't just guessing. He had stripped them bare, exposing every misstep and every moment of overconfidence that had led to this collapse. He articulated the motive behind the theft of the letters, explaining that the objective was never to sell them, but to destroy the subject's life piece by piece, an act of pure distilled resentment for a perceived slight that had occurred over a decade ago. It was a cold, clinical deconstruction. As Wolfe spoke, I could see the men wilting under the scrutiny. There was no room for denial, no space for the clever pivots and obfuscation Henderson had practiced in the courtroom. Wolfe was speaking in the language of facts, and facts were the one thing they couldn't counter. He didn't need to ask them to confess. He had already laid out their crime in such meticulous detail that the truth hung in the room, heavy and undeniable. I watched as Wolfe stood up, a rare monumental exertion that seemed to signal the finality of the proceedings. He didn't move toward them, but simply gestured toward the telephone on my desk. He told them that the police had been alerted, not by a formal complaint, but by the overwhelming weight of the evidence he had gathered. He explained that they had the choice to wait for the authorities to arrive or to provide a complete and signed statement right there in the office, a gesture of cooperation that would undoubtedly be noted by the district attorney. It was a bluff, or at least it was partially so, but it was delivered with such absolute unwavering authority that none of them had the strength to challenge it. Henderson was the first to break, his shoulders slumping as he realized the game was up. He looked at Julian, a look of profound bitterness, and then back at Wolfe, his voice barely a whisper as he asked if a cooperation agreement was truly possible. Wolfe merely tilted his head, his expression as impassive as a statue. He didn't make promises, he simply provided the opportunity for them to record their own downfall. I pulled a stack of paper and a fountain pen from my drawer and placed them on the table. The scratch of the pen on the page was the only sound in the room for a long time, a rhythmic, grating noise that marked the end of their ambition. They wrote, their hands shaking, the ink forming the final, damning tally of their arrogance. As they finished and handed the papers to me, I looked at Wolfe. He had returned to his chair, his eyes once again half closed, the air of absolute dominance returning to him like a cloak. The deception was stripped away, the actors were broken, and the Brownstone felt as if it had exhaled, the suffocating tension replaced by a quiet, settled victory. The anatomy of their failure was complete, and all that remained was the aftermath. 10. A matter of connoisseurship, the Brownstone was once again a sanctuary, the silence no longer brittle, but rich and heavy with the smell of floor wax and the faint, sweet perfume of the orchids. The police had come and gone, taking the men who had dared to think they could treat our home as their stage, and with them went the last of the tension that had gripped the house for the better part of a week. I watched from my desk as Wolfe, back in his element, carefully tended to a particularly temperamental cattleya that had suffered from his neglect during the proceedings. He worked with a patience that was entirely at odds with the surgical precision he had used to dismantle the lives of Henderson, Julian, and their accomplice. The letters had been returned to their owner, the stolen items had been logged into the police evidence room, and the dark, intricate web of malice had been swept away as if it were nothing more than common dust. Fritz came in from the kitchen, his apron pristine, and began the ritual of setting the table for dinner. The menu, as I had caught glimpses of earlier, was a triumph of the culinary arts, a rich, savory beef stew finished with a reduction of red wine and herbs, accompanied by a crusty loaf of bread and a salad of crisp, garden-fresh greens. The normalcy of the scene, the simple, ordered beauty of the preparation, felt like a direct rebuke to the chaos that had been visited upon us. I sat at my desk, my notebook closed for the final time on the case, and found that I had little appetite for the usual post-game breakdown. Wolfe didn't seek one either. He moved from the orchids to his chair with a slow, deliberate grace, his mind seemingly miles away, perhaps pondering the nature of the hubris he had just witnessed. As we sat down to eat, the conversation was sparse, limited to the subtle complexities of the flavor profiles Fritz had achieved, a topic they both approached with the gravity usually reserved for international treaties. It was only when the last of the wine had been poured and the final course, a delicate, lemon-infused custard, had been served that Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half closed, the picture of contentment. He spoke not of the arrest or the blackmail, but of the nature of the people who had brought it to our doorstep. He remarked that, in his experience, the most dangerous people were not those driven by passion or by an immediate, desperate need, but those who viewed life as a series of moves in a game they were destined to win. They fail, he noted, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack the ability to understand that some things are not for playing with. He tapped the table with a fingertip, a small, rhythmic motion that underscored his point. To violate the sanctity of a home, to build a narrative of intrusion, to believe that one could orchestrate the movements of another, these were not the actions of a criminal, they were the actions of an aesthete who had confused the art of the mystery with the reality of human consequences. They had treated the Brownstone as a prop, and in doing so, had exposed the hollowness of their own existence. It was a failure of connoisseurship, Wolfe concluded, the inability to distinguish between the game and the stakes. A man who does not respect the boundaries of another's life is a man who will eventually lose his own, not necessarily to the law, but to the weight of his own triviality. I listened, chewing slowly, feeling the familiar grounding presence of the house settle into my bones. Wolfe's words were sharp as always, and entirely devoid of sentiment, yet they felt like a benediction, a way of resetting the world to its proper, orderly state. He took a sip of his wine, the gold of the glass catching the light, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had not only solved a puzzle, but had restored a balance that had been briefly insolently tipped. Dinner ended with the usual flourish, a final check on the state of the household accounts, and then he was done. He rose, offered a brief nod that served as both a dismissal and a sign of mutual satisfaction, and retreated into the library, his sanctuary within a sanctuary. I stayed behind for a moment, listening to the quiet of the Brownstone, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hall, and the distant, reassuring sound of Fritz humming in the kitchen. It was over. The intruders were gone, the secrets were buried, and the house was once again a place where only the truth mattered. I closed my eyes, the memory of the past week fading into the background, and realized that for all the trouble, for all the late nights and the cold, hard logic, there was nowhere else I would rather be. The final act was complete, the stage was empty, and tomorrow, the house would be the same as it had always been. I stood up, feeling the weariness of the week drop away, and prepared to close the office for the night, knowing that for now, at least, the sanctity of our little corner of the world was secure, and that was more than enough.